The South, Slavery, and African American Culture, Part 2. The South did not have an especially healthy economy because everywhere you go in the South, it's a one-crop economy, certainly in the commercial South, with the crop varying from region to region: tobacco, rice, cotton, sugarcane, hemp. And why is a one-crop economy dangerous? Because you're putting all your eggs in one basket. And if anything goes wrong that growing season, you'll lose everything and you won't make any money. If there's a drought, a storm, a flood, an insect attack, or you could actually have a perfect growing season, everything goes right, you get a gigantic bumper crop, and then what happens? Supply and demand, there's an oversupply and the price falls through the floor. And so a one-crop economy is a dangerous, risky economy because you're putting all your eggs in one basket. So there were many Souths. It's also true there were many slaveries. When you read Frederick Douglass, you're going to be reading about slavery in Maryland, where the main crop was wheat. If you read Solomon Northup's autobiography, 12 Years a Slave, you'd be reading about slavery in Louisiana, where the crop is sugarcane, and that's a different form of slavery. And so the characteristics, the specifics of slavery varied from region to region throughout the South. The best way to study slavery is to study it by geographic region. We don't have time for that, so what we're going to do is just make some generalizations, but understand that they are generalizations about slavery. Slave work. 75% of the slaves labored in agriculture as field hands, usually but not always growing cotton. The other 25% of the slaves were craftsmen, house servants, things like that. The field hands worked every day except Sunday, from sunup to sundown. That might be a 14-hour workday in the summer. It might shrink down to a 10-hour workday in the winter. There was an overseer present to make sure the enslaved people worked, and the overseer would whip the slaves who didn't work. Often, the overseers were themselves slaves. It would not be unusual to see one slave whipping another in a cotton field. But usually the pattern was to have one white overseer present, and then several black slave drivers, as they were called. Solomon Northup in 12 Years a Slave, he was a slave driver, and so he's a black slave between the overseer and the field hands to make sure the slaves keep working. Often the overseers would set up contests or come up with other creative strategies to get work out of the slave labor force. So at the beginning of the day, the overseer might take a gang of slaves, divide them up into two teams, and make them compete against each other in picking cotton. The team that picked the most cotton at the end of the day would get a reward. The team that picked the least would get a punishment. Solomon Northup, in 12 Years a Slave, he writes about cotton picking in Louisiana. At the end of the day, each slave had their cotton weighed that they picked for the day. If it wasn't 200 pounds, you'd get whipped. But if you went over 200 pounds, say 215 pounds, that would be your new standard, and you'd have to pick 215 pounds every day or you'd get whipped. There were slack seasons and busy seasons, sometimes time off in bad weather, but overall the work was backbreaking and monotonous. Slave treatment. In return for their work, the slave was given almost nothing, which of course is the whole point of slavery. Slaves would receive a crude suit of clothing once or twice a year, and a one-room log cabin to live in. For their diet, the slaves received a weekly ration of fish or pork, but corn was the staple in the slave diet. If the slaves wanted anything more than that to eat, they had to grow it after hours on their own time or steal it. The poor diet often left many of the slaves suffering from dietary deficiencies. Here's a picture of the slave quarters at George Washington's Mount Vernon plantation. And so each slave family would live in a one-room log cabin like this that they'd build themselves. Notice how this log cabin is built. There's space between the logs, and the space is filled with mud. This is how the cabin would look in the winter. It's warm in there. But when summer comes, it gets really hot. And so what you do is you knock out the mud from between the logs and basically turn your cabin into a porch to give you good ventilation for the hot summer months. There's a vegetable garden in front of the cabin where the slaves would tend their own vegetables to supplement the food that the master gave them. And then off to the right, there's that thing with the netting over the top. That's a chicken coop, so that the slaves could have fresh poultry and fresh eggs. At Mount Vernon, George Washington's slaves carried firearms. His slaves were armed. Washington wanted it that way because it saved him a lot of money. What the slaves would do is they would take their firearms and they would go out in the forest and they would hunt. Hunt game animals. And then they would end up feeding themselves in an attempt to provide more protein into their diets. And that's food George Washington didn't have to provide. So the slaves having firearms and going out and doing their own hunting saved George Washington a lot of money. The field hands were kept almost totally isolated from the outside world. They were intentionally kept ignorant and illiterate. Slaves knew there was a place called the North where freedom existed, but they didn't even know which direction the North was, and the master tried to keep it that way if possible. Slave punishments. If a slave didn't work hard enough or misbehaved, the slave was beaten or whipped. Let me illustrate the brutality of slave punishments. If you've printed out the outline, on page 2 of the outline, I photocopied a page from a 19th century publication. At the top it says punishments, brandings, maiming, scars. Take a moment, stop the video, take a moment and read to yourself several of these entries. You can read anywhere on the page, but read several and then restart the video. What are these entries? These entries are classified ads from Southern newspapers offering a reward for the return of a runaway slave back to the master. Think about what are the distinguishing characteristics of slaves. How do you recognize a runaway slave? You recognize a runaway slave by the scars that the master has inflicted on the slave as punishment. Abolitionists in the North loved to search through Southern newspapers to find this sort of evidence of the brutality of slavery and then publish it in the North. And in fact, this page that I have photographed is just one page from a 19th century book called American Slavery as It Is, which was put together by the Grimke sisters, who we talked about when we looked at antebellum reform. But it's really good evidence against slavery because who's providing the evidence? The slaveholders themselves, providing the evidence of their own brutality. And if you don't believe it, you can look it up in the newspaper yourself. Slaves were physically beaten because there's really no other way to punish a slave. You can't fine an enslaved person. They don't have any money. You don't want to imprison an enslaved person because then they're not working. So what do you end up doing? You end up beating a slave. There was no legal limit to the punishment that could be inflicted on a slave. A master could kill his slave if he wanted to. In 1829, this exact issue came before the North Carolina Supreme Court. Could a master be punished legally for shooting and killing his own slave? And the Supreme Court, the North Carolina Supreme Court, ruled no. A master cannot be punished legally for killing his own slave. That's not murder. Here is one sentence from the court's ruling. The power of the master must be absolute to render the submission of the slave perfect. The power of the master must be absolute to render the submission of the slave perfect. Think about what that means. The moment the law limits the master's ability to punish his slave, that is, the moment the slave begins to have rights, slavery will fall apart and disintegrate. If slavery is going to exist, the master must have absolute power to punish his slave, even to the point of killing his slave. Okay, that's the logic here. If you limit the master's power to punish, slavery will fall apart. Now, why would a master ever kill a slave? A slave is worth a lot of money. Consider this table, which shows the value of slaves in 2007 dollars. And so starting at the top, an extra man, that's the best slave. A number one man, that's a better slave. A second-rate or ordinary man, that's a good slave. So it goes good, then go up a notch, better, up to the top. Extra men are the best. And so a slave man ranges in value in 2007 dollars from $26,000 all the way up to $38,000. And then the same thing with women. Extra women are the best slaves. Number one girls are good, better slaves. Second-rate or ordinary girls are just good slaves. And the prices there in 2007 dollars range all the way from $21,000 to $33,000 for a female slave. Or consider this chart. This chart shows the value of a slave by age. You can see a slave peaks in value at age 20, $900. And then you're already past your prime and your value starts to decrease. And here's a fuller version of this chart. But slaves' value starts at age 1, $100, peaks $900 at age 20, and then declines from there. So slaves are worth a lot of money. So why would a master ever kill a slave? Well, in some instances, killing a slave could, in a sick sort of way, make economic sense. Suppose you have literally 1,000 slaves, as some masters did, and they're getting uppity and misbehaving. You could kill one to make an example and make the other 999 behave better. In matters of passion and hatred, the master doesn't always do the economically rational thing, though. You could have a fit of rage and smash something, put your fist through the wall. Well, a master could have a fit of rage and kill a slave. There were many instances where masters would pursue a runaway into the north and pay many times what the slave was worth trying to recover the slave. Recovering a runaway often became a matter of pride, a contest of wills. It was more about power and control than money. In Southern culture, honor was so important among males, two whites would have a duel and risk death rather than to have their honor questioned. In that type of culture, no master is going to let a slave one up and win. Think what Andrew Jackson would do if one of his slaves ran away.